Hello and welcome to another BlenderWiz video tutorial. In this tutorial, we will be going over some different ways to use the newish physics simulator in Blender. We are going to be using it to break objects. We'll begin by installing one important add-on, which gives us a number of tools to make working with Bullet Physics Engine easier, and we will also enable self-fracturing so we can break our objects. Let's begin by installing the add-on. Begin by unzipping it to some directory. Once you have unzipped it, open up Blender and click File, User Preferences, and a new window will open up with all the user preferences. Click on the Add-ons tab, and in the bottom, a button that is labeled Install from File will appear. Click it, and it will change to a file browser. Navigate to wherever your bullet viewport constraints tool.py file is, and Blender will then install it. Now we can find it in our add-ons window. If it isn't already visible, the easiest way to find it is to search bullet viewport constraints. Once you see our tool, check the checkbox. We still have one more add-on to enable, so let's do that now. We want to enable cell fracture in the same manner. Search cell fracture, and once you see the cell fracture add-on, check the checkbox to enable it. Now that we have our add-on set up, it's time to go into creating the scene. So let's go ahead and position our camera into the front view. Press 1 on the number pad, and then let's hit Control Alt and then 0, and that will put our camera in front view mode, or into the front view. Now let's just drag this up a little bit and rotate it down toward the cube. Okay, now we're going to turn this cube into our floor. So press S and then Z and just scale it down like so. And something fairly thin. This could be a plane, but I'm just going to use a cube instead. And now hit S and then Shift Z to scale it along both the X and the Y axis, but not the Z. So something kind of like that. And then I'm just going to drag this up until we no longer see the edge. So drag the camera up. Next, let's go into side view mode here. Hit 5 to go into, or 5 on the number pad to go into orthographic mode. And then with our floor selected, hit Shift D to duplicate it, and then rotate it along the X by 90 degrees. And this is just going to make up our back wall, so let's just move it back right about there. Let's line this up a little bit better, and something kind of like that. It's a little bit tall, so I'm just going to scale it down along the Z-axis a little bit, and drag it down. Right like so. Next, we're going to go ahead and create a 3-point lighting setup. First, let's delete this default lamp, we don't really need it, and bring in, well, first let's discuss what a 3-point lighting system is. It has a key lamp, which is a fairly powerful lamp that kind of gives it a nice warm glow. Then there's a fill lamp, which isn't as powerful, but it just fills in the shadows so there aren't any harsh shadows. And then there's kind of backlight that just illuminates from the back edge. So we're going to have 3 lamps. The key lamp over here. I'm actually going to bring the camera in a little bit more. Key lamp over here, a little bit behind the camera and facing in toward the center. Then our fill lamp, which will be a cool color facing in toward the center this direction. And then a backlight back here, which will actually be up toward the top of this wall facing in to that center point as well. So let's go ahead and create a plane, and this will act as our key lamp. So let's name this lamp underscore key and drag that up like so. Let's rotate along the X. Something kind of like that should be good. Scale it up and go into top view mode. Rotate it like so, and just have it facing in toward the center. So kind of like that. Next, we should actually go ahead and name our scene pieces. So the cube should be called floor, and this back here should be called wall. Sorry, I forgot about doing that. It's just good practice to name parts. Now let's go ahead and give our lamp a material. So I'm just going to take this right here, drag it up, and then there's a little handle down here, and if you press it, you can actually create another view. And clicking on this button, we have a bunch of options. The one we want is Node Editor. Now, before you click anything, make sure that your render engine is set to Cycles Render. And then come over to this little panel right here and set the control to Materials and create a new material. There we go. So now really just replace that diffuse node with an emission node. So emission right there. Connect that up. And set the strength to 2.5. And let's give it a slightly warmish color. So something kind of like this right in there. Next, we're going to create the cool fill lamp. So hit Shift A and create a new plane. And let's drag this one up along the Z-axis. Scale it up a little bit. And let's just rotate it the other direction. And let's name this lamp underscore fill. Go into top view mode now. And just rotate it the opposite direction and place it right over here. Let's make sure that neither of those are actually in our camera. Maybe bring them in a little bit more. You really want them as close to the scene as possible without being in the view of the camera. Okay, so now let's go ahead and give this a new material. Let's name it lamp underscore fill. I think I forgot to do that for our key lamp here. Just go ahead and do that. Really, this is the same process. Delete that diffuse node, bring in another emission node, connect the two up. To do that, select both of them and press F. Set the strength to 2, and let's give it a slightly coolish color, so something right in this area, like so. Now to finish off our 3-point lighting system, it's time to create the backlight. So bring in another plane, let's drag this up along the Z, and this time let's rotate it along the X-axis. So go into side view mode by pressing 3 on the number pad, and just rotate over there. And let's scale this guy up, like so. The sharper the angle, because this is a plane, it won't be emitting light. Let's turn on the grease pencil. There we go. It won't be emitting light down in this direction. So right here on this fine edge here, it'll actually create a shadow on the wall, which is no good. Let's erase that. I just discovered how to use this and it's really fun. So what you want to do is you want to angle this so that this position on this wall right along there isn't actually inside of our camera, which it's not at this angle. It's just, it'll probably be down about there. So we should be good. So now we just want to scale that up along the X a little bit, and maybe a little bit down along its local Y. So hit S and then double tap Y, and that will give you its local Y. And something kind of like that should be good. So let's go ahead and give this a new material. Let's name it lamp underscore back. Delete the diffuse node and replace it with an emission node. Connect the two up, and we can leave this color at white. And I'm actually going to turn this down to about 0.25. And when you're done, when we render this, it should be something like that. Maybe we can bump this up a little bit. Let's try that. And it really shouldn't have that much effect. This is fairly good. It'll illuminate an object very nicely right here in the center. Now it's actually time to start getting into the physics. So first thing we want to do is we want to make this default 3D viewport the main screen again. So we take this handle right here, drag it downward, and you'll see this arrow right here. Release your click, and it will get rid of that window, or that viewer. So now this window right here is quite large. Next, what we want to do is we want to take these lamps and put them on their own render layer. That way they're kind of out of our way and we can see what we're doing. For this next part, we need to figure out what object we are going to shatter. It needs to be a complete object, no holes, none of that kind of thing. So unfortunately we can't do something like shatter our car that we made earlier, or the robot. Actually, we probably could shatter the robot, but I'm just going to shatter an ellipsoid. So what I'm going to do is bring in a UV sphere. Let's go into front view mode here, drag this up some, and then just scale it along the z-axis. Something kind of like that. And now what we do, we actually need to set up the rigid body. So select the floor here and click Add Passive. And what this will do is it'll tell the computer to compute or to calculate collisions with this object. And if we pop over to the physics panel, we can see that it's calculating the shape of the mesh. Now, that's generally slow, but honestly, this is a cube. It's a very, very simple object. It's what, 8 vertices? Yeah, so I don't think it really matters that much if it's mesh. Let's just set it to box anyway, just for funs. Next, we also want to set this one to the wall to passive as well, so that way when our shards go flying everywhere, they will bounce up against it instead of flying right through it. So let's set that to box as well. And now, let's take our ellipsoid here and click Add Active. And what that'll do is it'll tell the ellipsoid, or the computer, to compute where this ellipsoid will be when it's interacting with gravity and other active objects and the passive objects. If we press Alt-A now, you'll notice that it falls to the ground, and then because of little random errors, it'll eventually fall over. Now the reason it stays standing so long is we have this thing perfectly balanced on the endpoint. Well, obviously not, it's not obviously perfect, otherwise it would never actually tip over, but it's pretty close to perfect. So that's pretty fun, but I want it to tip over faster, so I'm just going to tip it already and it'll just fall right over. Now that we know that our physics works, let's go ahead and break this object. So the next step that we're going to be doing involves the cell fracture. Let's go ahead first. It prefers having square or close to square faces, so I'm just going to throw in some loop cuts here to add some geometry. And really we're just subdividing it like so. So once you get something like this that is adequately or has an adequate distribution of loop cuts, click the cell fracture. Now, this cell fracture system uses Voronoi cells to figure out how to fracture the object. The points here, the point source, it determines where these cells are. So let's discuss what each of these options does. The own verts, which is the one that we're going to be using, so let's click it and turn off own particles. The own verts shatters the object based on where the vertices are. And that is why we needed to kind of even out the distribution, because we have lots of vertices right down in this area. And then right up in here we had basically none. So you're going to get a ton of little tiny shards down here and up here, but really much larger ones in this midsection. So by evening this out, we have effectively fixed that to a certain extent. This is also quite good when you're shattering a more complicated object by having it collide with something. Not a bullet really, but having it collide with the floor. This is a very good option because it breaks the object based on the geometry. Child verts is kind of the same thing. I haven't really played around with it, but it's probably pretty much the same. Own particles pretty much creates a fairly even distribution of particles. I don't really like it as much because we don't have as much control over how it breaks the object. It's more even though. Child particles, probably the same thing. I haven't played around with that either. And grease pencil is actually the most fun. You take that little grease pencil that we had and you draw on the shape. And based on where you draw, it will figure out how to break it. So this is generally pretty good for a bullet. We have lots of control. This is probably the best for a bullet though. So a bullet will come in and it will kind of have these really small shards right near where the bullet hits and much larger shards as you go out. So you'll have a lot of lines drawn where the bullet enters and where it exits, and not as many lines out as you get further away from that point. So you have a lot of control with it. It takes a little bit longer to set up, but it's a good setting as well. So the source limits the number of shards. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to bump this. The higher the source limit, the more shards you're going to get. I'm just going to bump it up to 150. And then noise controls how jaggedy the edges are. So let's just turn that up to 1. Now, the recursive shatter down here will actually go in and break our shards again. So I'm just going to bump that to 2. It's pretty fun. It just gives us much smaller shards in some areas, and it gives it a bit more realism. Also, down here in the random, I'm just going to turn this number up to 0.5, and what this does is it changes the likelihood that a shard will be recursed upon. So right now we just have it set to 50%, so it's 50-50 whether the shard will get a recursion breaking done on it. So yeah, that's pretty good. Don't set this to 1, otherwise you'll be sitting there pretty much forever because it'll have to recurse and do that twice, and it'll take longer, which we don't want because we don't want every shard being broken again. Next, I'm just going to turn off these 2 settings there. Don't really need them. Actually, I'm not really sure what they do, but they definitely don't help things. They actually seem to not be helpful at all. And the rest of these settings looks good. We want this checked. It'll just recenter these pivot points to the center of our shards, which is helpful for collisions. Down here, we're just determining where it positions the shards. So it's going to take our shards and stick them on the next render layer. And then down here is just debugging information. So once we have this all set up, like so, just click OK. And then Blender will go nuts, build a little box, and then make it smaller, and then it will start recursing on those shards. Just let it go. And once it's done, you'll see your original object here and no shards. And that's because they're all over on the second layer. So this object right here is actually made up of a bunch of shards. And maybe if we can find some smaller ones, we can kind of see where the recursion happened. Maybe not as much, but there are all of our chunks. So it'll be pretty fun when this hits the ground. Since our shards are all new objects, they don't have the physics applied to them. So let's go ahead and do that now. First, take all of our things and let's hit Ctrl-G and assign them to a shards group. Next, come up here to the outliner and set it from all scenes to groups. And this will just make it easier for us to select each group. So we can just click on stuff. And now let's actually click Add Active. It'll tell us that it can't add rigid bodies to meshes with no polygons, and that's because some of our shards are actually they're just single vertices or edges. And that's, I don't think it's a bug, because obviously we won't actually notice when it happens, because it's invisible. So that's fine. Let's go ahead and hit Alt-A. Notice it completely exploded. And this is because, let's go ahead and delete those little buggers. This is because it's on the same collision group as our original object. And since they're both in the exact same position at the exact same time, they are technically intersecting, and Blender has no idea how to handle it. So it does the next best thing. It explodes. Now, let's go ahead and delete our original object, and that will fix this. Let's also bring over our shards and move them over to the first layer. Hello? First layer. Thank you. There we go. And now it'll just fall and shatter, and just like so. Which is kind of fun. A little wonky. Looks like we got a piece going nuts over there. So we'll have to fix that. But it doesn't shatter quite right. Notice how it barely hits the ground and it just completely falls apart. Actually, if we bring the ground up to it and hit Alt-A, it'll still just fall apart. That's like it's just sitting on the table and it just falls apart. And I'm sorry, but objects just don't do that. So we're going to have to fix that. We're going to have to actually make it hold together until it's supposed to fall apart. And that is where our little work in progress constraints tool comes in. Now, I will mention this is a work in progress. So sometimes it doesn't respond correctly. The past test that I did, it didn't exactly work right, so bear with me here a little bit just in case. We may be using this remove constraints a couple of times just to give it a chance to redeem itself and fix everything. So let's begin by giving our shards mass. So select all of our shards and click calculate mass. And I'm just going to set mine to brick. And let's just run that simulation again. It won't explode and be all crazy because it's got a little bit of mass and it actually knows what it's doing. Reason we did that is because this object, or this guy here, will use that mass to determine when to break the shards, or break the constraints. So what this bullet physics constraints tool does is it holds everything together until a certain impact occurs. And, well, technically, unless you turn on Breakable, it will not break. So let's play with this. Just click that X constraints button, and it will give these objects constraints. And if we let it drop, it kind of behaves a little weirdly. It never really stops bouncing around, and these parts are all just kind of trying to pull each other together. And this is because, according to the bullet constraints, the object isn't actually broken because we haven't checked Breakable. So it's trying to pull itself together. But at the very same time, the rigid body tools says these are all separate objects. So it's trying to pull it all apart. And in the end, you have this jittering, shaking mess of these objects that can't really decide whether to fall apart or come back together. And we should probably fix that so that we don't get things sliding back in and acting weirdly. But first, let's go ahead and play around with these constraints a little bit more. And in the end, we'll fix it. So select one, or select the group, rigid body constraints, and then just select one, random one. And let's play with these numbers. Neighbor limit is how many connections each constraint can have. So how many ways our shards can connect to other shards. And right now it's set to 3, so it's not very stiff. So let's turn that up 5 or 6, something like that. And then the search radius is how far it looks for the next constraint. So right in here we don't have that many constraints, so it's more likely to crack right here. So let's actually bump this up, not that high, probably about 10 should be good, and then click Update Selected. If we let that fall, it didn't quite work as it was supposed to. So let's go ahead and click that button there. Yeah. Buggy stuff. It's always fun to play with. Just select a shard, expand that, and click X constraints, and it'll figure stuff out. And now, there we go. That's what we wanted to see. It's a lot better held together. The top fell off, yeah, but overall, it's kind of holding itself together. And like, as you notice here, this piece isn't actually falling off, so it's fighting gravity to stay on here, and at the same time gravity is fighting its will, so in the end it's kind of just suspended there in equilibrium. But it's wrong. We need to break it. We actually need it to fall off. So what we're going to do, stop the animation, click on the rigid body constraints, let's select one like that, and we're going to turn on Breakable. And that, we need to check both of these break boxes, or these check boxes, to enable that. And I don't know why it's 2. It seems like we should just be able to press 1 and have it work. But you have to press 2. It's like, are you sure that you want to delete this? But I guess, are you sure that you want to break this? And we do. So click Update Selected, and over here, if you were in the physics panel, you'll notice that suddenly this breakable light comes on. If we press Alt-A, well, it didn't really do much, and that's because the threshold's too high. This break threshold right here is a coefficient. It determines exactly when the object breaks. It multiplies the mass against the coefficient, and if it receives an impact that is greater than that, the part falls off. At 10, it's the default. It works. The higher the coefficient, the less likely this is to break. The lower, if we turn it down to 0 and press Update Selected, it's going to shatter like it did before, like so. So if we turn this up to 1, update that, it will kind of fall apart, not as much. And if we turn this up, I don't know, 2, you get the point. It tries to hold itself together. Oh, that was a cool break. I enjoyed that. We're not really falling that far. Let's lower this. Watch it really break. Oh yeah, that was fun. So this is pretty mesmerizing. Have fun with it. Enjoy it. Break a rabbit. Break Suzanne. Break everything. Break all the things. Let it shatter all over the floor. And of course no one has to clean it up because they're just virtual objects. It's so much more fun than reality. Anyone who's stuck in reality, I feel sorry for. So there we go. So that's working pretty well. I enjoyed 2. 2 seems to get the job done. Let's take this camera and play with it a little bit. Here we go. And that's too high. There we go. So that's looking pretty good. Technically, you could be done right now. What you could also do, if you wanted, this seems to be working pretty well for me. If it's not working that well for you, tried playing with these down here, the steps per second and the solver iterations, and this will just increase the accuracy of the physics. So higher number, if you were to multiply this by 2 or something, it would take a lot longer, so your frames per second would go way down, but it would be a much more accurate simulation. It can be a good thing and a bad thing. Really, it doesn't change anything, it just makes it more accurate. And then I do recommend, if you turn this up a lot, I recommend using these cache tools instead of the animation, just having it animate, because you're less likely to crash, for one, and it's just easier. Of course, you'll have to rebake it every time you change anything. So I'm going to leave it. Let's click Bake All Dynamics. It's already pretty much baked, so it's good. And that is pretty well working. Let's go ahead and actually give this a material. Okay, so we're going to go ahead now and create a fairly simple ceramic-y material. First, what I want to do though is create or make the outside of this thing smooth. So let's go ahead and select all of the objects here. Hit T to bring up our tools panel, and just come up here to shading and set it to smooth. It'll look terrible now. It kind of looks, I don't know, they look more like stones sort of thing. I'm not really sure, but it looks weird. To fix this, just come over to modifiers. Let's go ahead and select one that we know that we can select again. Hit edge split, and then hit Control L modifiers. And that'll just fix everything. And now it looks a lot better than it used to. So that's good. Next, let's go ahead here and separate this guy again. Because what we're going to do, technically we don't need the timeline anymore, but let's just keep it around anyway. Create a new material, although bring up a node editor first. With one of these guys selected, create a new material. Let's call it ceramic. And first thing we're going to do is delete our diffuse node. Ceramic's actually a really interesting material to look at. It has kind of a bit of a depth, I guess. So we're going to do that. So let's go ahead. We need a mix node, mix shader node. Connect that in like so. To connect them, once again, just select both of them, press F, and we're going to actually work right now to give it that nice, shiny, glossy coat. Let's bring up the preview window. Right now, since it's not connected to anything on the inputs, it's just a black hole, black sphere. So let's bring in a glossy node and connect that into the bottom. Can't see it? Well, I guess we can. That was unexpected. Let's turn this down. Should be about 0.1 so that it's not too obvious. And let's just turn this down. Should be fairly sharp, maybe not that sharp. Maybe a little bit more. Yeah, that's too much. We want about 0.1 in that neighborhood. And that should be good for that glossy coat. Actually, we could probably switch that to CGX. I like the results from CGX quite a bit. And that's going to be too sharp. 0.05. Play around with those numbers a little bit. See what you like. And let's go ahead and bring in another mix shader here. Connect that guy in like so. Okay. And now we're going to start dealing with some fun stuff here. Bring in a diffuse node. Connect those two up like so. Starting to look a bit better. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a layer weight to control the mix amount. So facing like so. So that means that the top here is what's facing us. So we can adjust how this is. Let's change the blend, maybe 0.9. And that will give us that inner color here. So out here, we're going to be giving it other colors, kind of a yellowish tint. And then here it's going to be slightly cooler. So let's tint this now, like so, something like that. Good enough. Bring in another mix shader here. Connect those two guys up like so. Bring in a diffuse node and duplicate that again. We want to connect all three of them. There we go. And these two are going to be yellowish tint. Let's bring in a Fresnel, connect that into the factor, and give this one a slightly yellow, light yellow tint. You can see it quite a bit there. And then the outer edges a little bit more. So just play around with that, get it to kind of where you like it. Once you do, just select all of our shards, hit Control L, and click on Materials, and now they all have our ceramic material. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. If you want to see more in the future, please subscribe to BlenderWiz if you haven't already. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please like it, and feel free to watch more tutorials while you are at it. Any feedback, recommendations, or suggestions for future tutorials are welcome. Thank you for watching.